In the final months of World War II, a group of captured German engineers were brought to a quiet Allied airfield. On the runway sat a strange American fighter. Heavy, rugged, nothing like the sleek machines they'd built for the Luftwaffe. They laughed at it until the cowling came off. Inside the engine bay, they found something that defied their expectations, a masterpiece of simplicity, power, and endurance. The moment they opened that engine, they realized America hadn't just won the war with numbers, it had won with genius in plain sight. This is the story of the engine that changed their minds and proved that American engineering could do what German precision never could. At the dawn of World War II, the sky became the final frontier of supremacy. Nations raced not only for land and power, but for altitude, speed, and dominance above the clouds. The one who controlled the air would control the war. In the early years, Germany led that race. Its aircraft, sleek and fearsome, sliced through the skies with unmatched precision. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 were marvels of design, fast, agile and deadly. They were born from an obsession with perfection, from factories where tolerances were measured in microns and pride was the highest currency. Across the ocean, the United States was watching and learning. Its early aircraft were rugged, reliable, but far from elegant. American factories could build in numbers, but not in refinement. Not yet. Engineers in the US studied reports from Europe, quietly planning a response that would come to define a new kind of power. In 1939, in a workshop in Connecticut, a team at Pratt & Whitney was assembling something different. An engine that was not delicate, but defiant. Not beautiful, but unstoppable. They called it the R2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row, 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. It was loud, heavy, and built for war. The German engines, designed by Daimler-Benz and BMW, were works of art. Liquid-cooled, precise, and finely balanced, they represented a belief that engineering should be elegant. The American approach was the opposite. The Double Wasp was air-cooled. It didn't need radiators or coolant lines that could fail under fire. It was a brawler, designed to survive what no refined machine could. As the US entered the war, this philosophy began to reshape the battlefield. American factories did not aim to build perfect machines. They aimed to build thousands of strong ones, machines that could be repaired on muddy airstrips, serviced by young mechanics with wrenches instead of scientists with degrees. From this idea was born one of the most formidable aircraft of the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt. A monster of metal and power, it stood nearly twice the weight of many German fighters. Pilots joked that it looked like a flying tank. They also knew it could dive faster, climb higher, and, most importantly, take damage that would destroy any other plane. Its engine, the R2800, was the beating heart of that legend. When it roared to life, it shook the ground. Pilots felt the vibration through their bones, the kind of raw power that no cockpit gauge could measure. It could climb through a storm of flak, escort bombers deep into enemy territory, and still fly home with half its cylinders shot out. Germany's pilots began to notice this strange, massive fighter. Reports filtered back to command. They called it the Jug, short for juggernaut. It was heavy, unrefined, and in their eyes, an insult to aerodynamics. But as the missions went on, those same pilots watched it survive things their own aircraft could not. While the Germans built perfection, the Americans built endurance. While the Luftwaffe struggled to replace lost engines and maintain its intricate designs, the United States was producing a new fighter every hour. Assembly lines roared day and night. Women and men in denim uniforms riveted wings, forged pistons, and filled the air with the rhythm of mass production. Every Thunderbolt that rolled out carried the same promise: strength over style, simplicity over sophistication. It was the embodiment of the American idea that greatness lies not in doing something delicate, but in doing something that lasts. By 1943, the skies of Europe had begun to shift. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, was losing ground. Allied bombers were reaching Berlin. P-47s escorted them, diving through enemy formations, taking hits and still climbing back into the fight. Pilots told stories of landing with engines smoking, wings torn, and holes in their fuselage, yet the double wasp still turning. Mechanics joked that the engine didn't run on fuel, it ran on stubbornness. At German air bases, disbelief grew. Reports from downed pilots mentioned this new enemy aircraft, impossibly strong, terrifyingly durable. Some said it could dive faster than gravity itself. Others refused to believe the stories. They called it propaganda. But engineers inside Germany began to wonder, could the Americans really have built something this reliable, this powerful, and this simple? In 1944, those questions turned into obsession. The Luftwaffe's testing division at Rechlin received fragments of captured Thunderbolts, pieces of engines, parts of fuselages, charred cylinders. What they saw didn't make sense. The materials were ordinary, the design straightforward, and yet it worked better than anything they had. To the German mind, trained to equate complexity with superiority, this simplicity was impossible. They dismissed it. They laughed. They moved on to the next design, convinced that their way was still the best. Then, in 1945, the war ended. The laughter stopped. In the ruins of airfields, among broken Messerschmitts and burned factories, stood the machines they had once mocked, American Thunderbolts, intact and waiting. The Allies invited German engineers to examine them. What they would find inside the cowling of that massive radial engine would humble them. The moment they opened it, they would see how a nation that prized practicality over perfection had built an engine that not only won battles, but changed the course of history. The race for the skies was over. The age of American engineering had begun. The German factories of 1941 were cathedrals of precision. The air smelled of oil, metal, and victory. Engineers in white coats walked among rows of engines, suspended like sculptures, their polished casings reflecting the fluorescent light. Every screw, every weld, every spark plug carried the weight of a nation's pride. For the German mind, engineering was not just work, it was philosophy. Machines were to be perfect, precise, and flawless. A true engineer sought harmony between mathematics and art. The Luftwaffe's fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, embodied that belief. Their engines were mechanical masterpieces, the Daimler-Benz DB 605, the BMW 801. Compact, sleek, and efficient, they represented the peak of human craftsmanship. When German pilots flew these aircraft, they believed they were untouchable. Their machines climbed faster, turned sharper, and looked smoother than anything the Allies had. In every briefing, every test flight, that superiority was reinforced. German technology was the best in the world, and the rest were imitators. Reports of American aircraft were treated as jokes. The Luftwaffe's intelligence officers described the new US fighters as industrial toys, heavy, slow, and unsophisticated. The P-47 Thunderbolt in particular was mocked. Its frame was thick, its engine massive, its shape inelegant. A flying milk jug, they said laughing, typical of American excess. The truth was that the Germans could not understand a different kind of genius. They saw brute force where there was innovation. They saw overbuilding where there was endurance. They mistook simplicity for weakness. Inside Germany's research centers, engineers competed for perfection. Every project sought refinement, lighter pistons, thinner casings, tighter tolerances. The engines were tuned like violins, each part crafted by skilled hands. But perfection demanded time, and time was running out. By 1943, the Allied bombing campaign began to suffocate the German industry. Aluminum was rationed, skilled machinists were drafted into the army. Factories that once turned out engines in silence now shook under the roar of explosions. Production slowed, but the demand for perfection did not. Engines that once took days to build now required weeks. Replacement parts were rare. Every time a fighter was shot down, another hour of precision was lost forever. The Luftwaffe's engineers, chained to their own ideals, refused to simplify. They would rather lose time than lose accuracy. Across the Atlantic, the Americans took a different approach. The factories of Pratt & Whitney and Wright Aeronautical roared day and night. Their workers didn't handcraft, they assembled. Their designs weren't polished, they were practical. The American way was simple. Build it strong, build it fast, build it again. In 1943, the first full squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts crossed into European skies. They were enormous, almost twice the weight of a Bf-109. But what shocked the Germans was not their size, it was their endurance. Pilots returned from missions with engines smoking, wings shredded, fuselages punctured by flak, yet the Thunderbolts kept flying. The R-2800 Double Wasp refused to die. It could lose cylinders, burn oil, and still produce power. No German engine could do that. At first, the Luftwaffe dismissed the reports as exaggerations, but as the war dragged on, disbelief turned into unease. The P-47s escorted bombers deep into German airspace, further than anyone thought possible. They dove through anti-aircraft fire, engaged in dogfights, and climbed back into formation, over and over again. Engineers at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's top testing center, began to investigate. Pieces of downed Thunderbolts were brought in, fragments of fuselage, twisted propellers, sections of the massive engine. They studied them in silence. The materials were not rare. The design was not beautiful. The manufacturing marks were coarse, almost industrial, but the results were undeniable. The Americans had built something that broke every German rule, and it worked. Inside the laboratories, younger engineers began whispering heresy. Maybe the Americans had found a better way. But the older generation dismissed them. They build tractors, one said, not machines of war. Yet on the front lines, pilots were seeing the truth. The Luftwaffe was losing its edge. For every German aircraft produced, America built 20. For every refined machine that rolled out of a German factory, 100 rugged engines thundered out of American ones. The contrast could not have been greater. The Germans chased elegance. The Americans built power. One sought perfection. The other sought victory. By late 1944, the cracks were visible. The Luftwaffe was exhausted. Its planes, though beautiful, were fragile. Its pilots, though skilled, were outnumbered. And still, deep in their hearts, the engineers clung to their belief that complexity was strength and simplicity was weakness, that illusion would not survive the end of the war. In the spring of 1945, as Allied troops advanced through Germany, the factories that had once built the pride of the Reich lay in ruins. The engineers who had sworn by precision now stood amid wreckage and silence. And in captured airfields across the country, they began to encounter something new. The machines they had ridiculed. Parked in rows under the grey sky were American P-47s, their cowling plates streaked with oil and soot, their radial engines scarred but intact. The Germans, curious and skeptical, approached the aircraft with the eyes of men who had spent their lives mastering machines. They thought they knew what they would find inside. Crude metal, sloppy wiring, heavy parts. But what waited beneath the cowling would change their understanding of engineering forever. The war was ending. Germany's cities lay in ruins. Factories that once roared with precision now stood silent and cold. Among the rubble, The men who had built the pride of the Luftwaffe waited. Engineers, designers, scientists, men who had believed their machines would rule the skies forever. Then came the order. Allied officers wanted them to examine the American aircraft that had dominated the war's final years. Captured Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and bombers were brought to a quiet airfield in western Germany. The engineers would study them, piece by piece, and report their findings. It was early morning. Fog drifted across the cracked runway. A line of P-47 Thunderbolts sat under the grey sky, their olive paint streaked with soot and oil, their massive propellers still. The Germans approached cautiously, notebooks in hand, their boots echoing in the silence. They had seen these planes before, at a distance, through gun sights, falling from the clouds like armored beasts. Now, face to face, they looked impossibly large. The P-47 dwarfed the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs they had built. Its fuselage was thick, its frame built like a fortress. They climbed the ladders, studied the rivets, the thick armor plating, the heavy control cables. One muttered, almost amused, "So this is what they called a fighter." Another shook his head. "It looks like a tractor." But when they reached the engine, the laughter stopped. Mechanics from the Allied command began unbolting the cowling. The metal plates fell away with a clank, revealing the heart of the machine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. The Germans leaned in, silent. 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 perfect rows, pipes and manifolds weaving like veins of metal. The smell of burnt oil and iron filled the air. It was nothing like the engines they had built. It was heavier, rougher, more primitive, and yet it pulsed with purpose. They expected to find chaos. Instead, they found balance. Every part was built for endurance. The cooling fins were thick, the ignition system redundant, the fuel lines simple and easy to reach. The Americans had thought not about aesthetics, but about survival. One engineer crouched beside the crankcase and whispered, "You could take a bullet through this, and it would still turn." Another touched the metal surface and added quietly, "It was never about perfection, it was about power." They began measuring, sketching, calculating. Their pencils scratched across the paper in disbelief. The compression ratios were lower than expected. The tolerances were wide. The design ignored almost every principle of German precision. And yet, the numbers didn't lie. This engine produced more power than anything they had built. The realization came slowly, like a wound opening. The Americans hadn't just copied technology, they had reinvented it. While German engines demanded perfect fuel, precise maintenance, and delicate balance, the R2800 was designed to thrive in chaos. It could run on lower quality gasoline. It could be repaired by mechanics in the mud. It could lose a cylinder, or 2, or 3, and keep flying. The Germans had built racehorses, the Americans had built workhorses. One of the older engineers, a designer from BMW, stared into the engine for a long time. His voice broke the silence. "We laughed at them," he said. "We thought they were clumsy, but this is genius." A young assistant beside him scribbled notes furiously. "It's too heavy," another muttered. The older man turned, shaking his head. "No, it's strong. That's the difference." They continued to inspect the aircraft through the morning. They found the same pattern everywhere. Simplicity, hiding intelligence. The fuel system could be replaced in minutes. The electrical wiring was color-coded. The panels were standardized so that any mechanic anywhere could fit them. It was a revelation. The Americans hadn't just built a plane, they had built a philosophy. At noon, one of the officers overseeing the examination handed them a report from Allied pilots. It listed combat statistics, missions completed, damage sustained, aircraft returned. The Germans read in silence. Hundreds of Thunderbolts had returned home with damage that would have destroyed any German fighter. One entry stood out. A pilot had flown 200 miles with 2 cylinders dead, oil leaking and one wing half torn. He landed safely. The room fell quiet. No one spoke for several minutes. The truth could no longer be ignored. They had been defeated not by superior theory, but by superior understanding, a different kind of intelligence. The Americans had recognized what the Germans never had, that in war, machines must serve men, not the other way around. The Germans had built masterpieces that demanded perfect conditions. The Americans had built tools that conquered imperfection. As the day ended, the engineers closed their notebooks. The sun broke through the clouds, reflecting off the silver edges of the Thunderbolt's wings. They stood there for a moment, silent, as if in mourning. Not just for their nation, but for their illusion of superiority. One of them turned to another and spoke softly. "We thought they had no culture," he said, "but they understood progress better than we did." The Allied officer beside them, hearing the words, simply nodded. The Germans stepped away from the plane. Behind them, the massive engine still glistened with oil, its cylinders like the ribs of a living creature. For the first time, they understood what they had been fighting against, not just an army, not just an industry, but a way of thinking. That day, they didn't see the enemy. They saw the future. The war was over. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. German engineers, once surrounded by the hum of machines and the roar of engines, now stood in a new kind of battlefield, one of ideas, not weapons. They had spent years building engines that reflected their nation's pride, intricate, refined, mathematically flawless. But as they studied the American P-47 Thunderbolt, the truth began to sink in. Everything they had believed about engineering, progress, and power was wrong. In the hangar, the smell of oil lingered in the air. A single P-47 sat on its landing gear, its cowling open, sunlight reflecting off the dark steel of its massive radial engine. Around it, German and American engineers stood together, divided by language, but united by curiosity. The Americans explained their philosophy with calm confidence. "We build for men, not for museums," one said. "If a pilot can land it, fix it, and fly it again, that's perfection." The Germans listened. Some nodded. Others frowned. It was the opposite of everything they had been taught. For years, they had believed that elegance and precision defined mastery. But now, looking at the Thunderbolt's engine, they saw a different kind of intelligence. One that favored simplicity, speed, and resilience over artistry. In Germany, factories had been small, specialized, and proud. Each component was crafted by hand, adjusted by skilled workers. Every engine was unique. In America, factories looked like cities. Endless rows of machines stamped out identical parts. Assembly lines moved day and night. Anyone could replace a piston, fit a valve, install a bearing. That was the first shock. The realization that genius could be industrial. That power could come not from a single craftsman's hand, but from the combined rhythm of thousands. The second shock came when they studied how the Americans maintained these machines. The Thunderbolt's manuals were thick, printed in clear language, filled with diagrams that even a novice could follow. Each system had redundancy. Each component could be removed and replaced in minutes. It wasn't about perfection, it was about continuity. One German engineer turned the pages of the maintenance guide slowly. "They wrote this," he said quietly, "for soldiers, not for engineers." And that perhaps was the greatest difference of all. In Germany, machines demanded respect. Pilots served them, mechanics obeyed them. But in the United States, machines served men. A broken engine wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity to build another, better one. The engineers walked around the aircraft, measuring, observing, sketching. Every part told the same story, functionality before form. The wings were thick, the rivets exposed, the armor heavy. But each of those choices made sense. Every extra pound meant protection. Every simplified mechanism meant reliability. There was no arrogance in this design, only purpose. For the first time, the German engineers felt something they hadn't known in years: humility. They began to see beauty in what they once called crude. One of them spoke quietly to an American officer. "Your planes," he said, "are not beautiful." The officer smiled. "They don't need to be," he replied. "They just need to come home." That answer stayed with him. As days passed, the Germans continued to disassemble the Thunderbolt, studying its systems, its materials, its power. What struck them most was how ordinary everything seemed: the alloys, the bolts, the wiring. There were no exotic metals, no secret formulas. The strength came from design, not from luxury. It was as if the Americans had mastered the art of doing more with less. When the examinations ended, the Germans gathered their notes. The head engineer looked around the hangar one last time. His team stood silently beside the American plane, the embodiment of everything they had misunderstood. He spoke softly. "We were building jewels," he said. "They were building tools." That sentence captured the moment perfectly. In the years that followed, many of those same engineers would cross the ocean under new flags. They would work in American laboratories, on jet engines, rockets, and spacecraft. They would bring their precision, but they would also carry what they learned that day: that true innovation lives not in complexity, but in clarity. They had seen a new definition of engineering, one that combined intelligence with humility, power with practicality. When the Americans built the R-2800, they hadn't just created an engine. They had created a symbol of a nation that believed strength was not born from perfection, but from perseverance. The Germans left the airfield changed. They had witnessed the beginning of a new era, one where machines no longer needed to be flawless, to be extraordinary. As the hangar doors closed behind them, the P-47 stood silent, gleaming in the afternoon light. Its engine, though still, seemed alive, a monument to a philosophy that had won the war not only in the skies, but in the minds of those who once opposed it. For the men who had built the Luftwaffe, it was a revelation. For the Americans, it was just another day's work. The war had ended, but its echoes lived on in every hangar, every factory, every laboratory where engineers gathered to rebuild a broken world. Across Germany, men who had once designed the engines of the Luftwaffe now stood in silence, facing the reality that their machines, once symbols of perfection, had been defeated by something simpler, stronger, and wiser. In the months that followed, teams of American officers visited the ruins of German facilities. They collected blueprints, prototypes, and instruments, but they also invited the German engineers themselves to come west, to learn, to work, and to build again. What began as defeat soon became a strange alliance, one that would shape the next century. Those who accepted found themselves in a new kind of world. In the United States, factories stretched beyond the horizon. Assembly lines hummed without pause. The smell of oil and metal was the same, but the atmosphere was different. There was no obsession with flawlessness, no fear of imperfection. Here, progress was measured in motion, in how fast an idea could become reality. The former German engineers were astonished. Machines were no longer built by artisans, but by systems. Every part had a purpose, and every purpose served efficiency. It was engineering stripped of vanity. They realized that America's greatest invention wasn't any single machine. It was the process of creation itself. The lessons they had learned in that quiet hangar beside the P-47 Thunderbolt became the foundation of a new age. The same men who once designed fighters for the Luftwaffe would soon work on jet engines for the US Air Force. The same minds that built the V-2 rocket would help send men to the moon, and through it all, One principle guided them: make it work, make it last, make it better. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 had proven something the world could no longer ignore: that simplicity, when guided by intelligence, could outperform perfection. The engine's design became a textbook of modern engineering. Redundancy, accessibility, modularity, concepts that would echo through generations of machines. Aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and the F-100 Super Sabre would inherit the philosophy born from that radial giant. Even the jet age, with its sleek turbines and afterburners, carried the same American DNA: durability over delicacy, practicality over pride. For the German engineers, this was a revelation that changed not only their work, but their worldview. They had been taught that power came from control. Now they saw that power came from freedom. Freedom to fail, to rebuild, to simplify. As industries around the world began to rebuild, they all drew from the same source. Automobiles, ships, machines, and even the first computers began to reflect that American way of thinking: make it understandable, make it reproducible, make it serve people. In classrooms, engineering students studied both traditions: the old European craftsmanship and the new American pragmatism. The conclusion was clear: the future belonged to those who could combine both: precision with purpose, beauty with resilience. In 1949, a German engineer who had once mocked the Thunderbolt wrote in his journal, "We built perfection and it failed us. They built functionality and it freed them." His words spoke for a generation that had witnessed the shift of power, not just political, but intellectual. Meanwhile, in America, the factories that had built the P-47 continued to grow. The roar of the double wasp faded, replaced by the whine of jet turbines. But the philosophy remained the same. The blue-collar genius that had filled the skies in 1944 was now fueling a new race, not for domination, but for discovery. When the first American jet broke the sound barrier, its pilots and engineers owed part of that moment to the lessons learned in the war. Lessons written not in theory, but in experience. When NASA began designing spacecraft 2 decades later, many of the engineers behind those rockets still remembered the simplicity of that radial engine, the strength that came from straightforward design. The legacy of the R2800 was more than mechanical. It was moral. It reminded the world that progress doesn't belong to the proud. It belongs to the persistent. It taught that genius is not measured by how complex something is, but by how it endures. Even decades later, the story of the German engineers and the American engine remains one of the most powerful lessons in human history. It was not a story of humiliation, but of revelation, the moment when science humbled pride and innovation transcended borders. On that airfield in 1945, 2 worlds had met, one that worshipped precision and another that worshipped practicality. In their collision, humanity found balance. From that meeting came the future: the jet age, the space age, and an industrial world that would never again underestimate the power of simplicity. The old engineers grew older, their hands now still, their notebooks archived in quiet museums. But the machines they studied, the P-47s, the Thunderbolts, the roaring symbols of America's industrial heart, still stand in hangars across the world. Their engines no longer run, but the idea they represent still burns as brightly as ever. Because in the end, the Thunderbolt was more than a fighter. It was proof that the strength of a nation lies not in the complexity of its machines, but in the clarity of its purpose. Proof that the simplest idea, to build something that lasts, can change the course of history.